The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ashford Manor, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Victoria Sterling sat reviewing quarterly reports. At 32 years old, she was the youngest CEO in the history of Sterling Industries, a multinational conglomerate that had dominated the luxury goods market for over a century. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her emerald eyes focused with the intensity of a predator, and her tailored Chanel suit spoke of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world. She was beautiful in an intimidating way, the kind of beautiful that made people nervous, that suggested a mind as sharp as any blade forged in Sheffield steel. Her father had once told her that beauty was a weapon, and Victoria had learned to wield it masterfully. The office door opened without a knock, and James Sterling strode in, his still powerful frame belying his 64 years. Her father was a man of imposing presence, his silver hair and weathered face the map of a lifetime spent building an empire. He held a cigar in one hand and wore the satisfied smile of a man who had just closed a particularly advantageous deal. "The Medici acquisition is complete," he announced, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. "They didn't even counter our final offer. They knew they were beaten." Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. They should have negotiated harder. Their luxury line would have been worth 20% more if they'd held firm. "Perhaps," said James, regarding his daughter with an expression that was part pride, part something else, something that looked almost like hunger. "But that's why I've brought you into the fold. You see things that others miss. You understand that in business, hesitation is death." "And compassion is weakness," Victoria finished, reciting a lesson her father had taught her since childhood. James leaned forward, his dark eyes, the same shade as Victoria's own, gleaming with approval. "Exactly. This world isn't built for the weak or the sentimental. It's built for those willing to make the hard choices, the necessary sacrifices. And you, my daughter, you have the appetite for it." Victoria set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk, a gesture of patience she'd perfected over the years. "I've been meaning to discuss the future with you. I want to accelerate the timeline. If we move aggressively on 3 acquisitions simultaneously, we can corner the Asian market within 18 months. "I've raised a worthy successor," James said, and Victoria felt a familiar warmth bloom in her chest. Despite everything, despite the voice in the back of her mind that sometimes whispered about the emptiness of such victories, she craved her father's approval above all else. It was the coin in which he measured love. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "I'm attending the Hensworth Foundation Gala tonight. You should come. It's good for your profile, the young, brilliant, ruthless beauty. The press eats it up, and it keeps people off balance. Never let them think they understand you." After he left, Victoria returned to her reports, but her mind was elsewhere. For just a moment her expression softened. She thought of her childhood, before everything became about power and acquisition and dominance, before her mother had left when she was 8, unable to bear the cold precision of James Sterling's love. Before Victoria had learned that the way to fill the void left by her mother's departure was to become what her father valued most, invincible. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to be understood rather than feared. The thought passed quickly. There was work to be done. The Hensworth Foundation Gala was held at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, one of the city's most exclusive venues. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and was filled with the city's elite, politicians, industrialists, celebrities, and old money made new. Victoria moved through the crowd in a stunning black gown by Valentino, a diamond necklace at her throat that had belonged to her grandmother, and an expression of cool interest that made people either desperately want to talk to her or desperately want to avoid her. Her father was across the room, discussing something with a senator, his hand on the man's shoulder in that familiar gesture of controlled intimacy that he'd perfected over decades. Victoria watched him with analytical eyes. James Sterling was a masterclass in manipulation. Every movement calculated, every word chosen for maximum effect, every gesture designed to make the recipient feel simultaneously important and vulnerable. She was so focused on her father that she almost collided with the man crossing her path. "I apologize," he said, his voice warm and tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Victoria looked up and found herself staring at one of the most striking men she'd ever seen. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead and eyes the color of autumn leaves. He was handsome in a way that suggested he'd never particularly cared about being handsome. There was an ease about him, a kind of natural grace that came from genuine comfort in his own skin. He was smiling at her with genuine warmth, not the calculated expression of someone trying to impress or intimidate her. It was deeply unsettling. "It's fine," Victoria said, her cool demeanor firmly back in place. She made to move past him, but he shifted slightly, extending his hand. "Adrian Blackwood," he introduced himself. "I'm assuming you're someone important, given the way the room seems to part for you like the Red Sea." Victoria took his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the warmth of his palm. "Victoria Sterling." "Ah," Adrian said, his expression becoming more thoughtful. "The Victoria Sterling, the corporate executioner. I've read about you." "I hope the accounts were accurate," Victoria said, not bothering to correct him or offer false modesty. "They said you were ruthless, brilliant, and beautiful," Adrian said. "I can verify at least 2 of those from personal observation. As for ruthless, I'm reserving judgment." "Wise," Victoria said. "And what about you, Adrian Blackwood? Should I know who you are?" "Probably not," he said cheerfully. "I'm an architect. I design buildings. My work is mostly in sustainability and community spaces, not particularly glamorous or profitable, which is why the name probably means nothing to you." There was no criticism in his tone, just a statement of fact. Victoria found this oddly refreshing. Most people who attended these events were desperate to establish their importance, to prove they mattered. Adrian seemed entirely unbothered by whether she'd heard of him or not. "I actually have heard of you," she said, surprised to find it was true. "The community center in Portland last year. It was nominated for the Pritzker Prize." Adrian's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You follow architecture?" "I follow interesting things," Victoria said, which was a half-truth. In reality, she followed industry reports that covered all sectors, including architecture, mining for competitive advantages, and market trends. But something made her hesitate to reduce her interest in his work to such a clinical explanation. "Would you like to get some air?" Adrian asked, gesturing toward the terrace. "I find these events suffocating." Victoria's first instinct was to decline. She was here to be seen, to network, to project power and influence. She was not here to have genuine conversations with architects who designed community centers. But there was something about Adrian's presence that made her want to step outside the carefully constructed persona that was Victoria Sterling, CEO. "All right," she said. The terrace overlooked the city skyline, and the night air was cool and clean after the stuffy warmth of the ballroom. Adrian leaned against the marble railing, and Victoria stood beside him, maintaining professional distance. "Tell me something," Adrian said. "Do you actually enjoy any of it? The business, the dominance, the acquisition of things?" Victoria bristled slightly. "That's a very personal question for someone I just met." "True," Adrian acknowledged. "I have a tendency to ask inappropriate questions. It's one of my many flaws. But you seem like the kind of woman who appreciates directness." "I enjoy the exercise of will," Victoria said carefully, "the ability to shape the world according to my vision, the achievement of goals. Yes, I enjoy those things." "But do you enjoy them, or do you think you should enjoy them?" Adrian pressed. "There's a difference." "I don't see how my motivations are relevant to you." "You're right, they're not," Adrian said, and he smiled, not mockingly, but with a kind of gentle understanding that made Victoria want to push him away and pull him closer simultaneously. I'm sorry, I tend to be intrusive. It's because I genuinely find people interesting. Most people in that ballroom are playing roles. They're performing versions of themselves they think others want to see. But you seem like you're actually committed to the role you're playing. That's either impressive or tragic. I haven't decided which. Tragic, Victoria said, surprising herself. You think it's tragic? A little, Adrian admitted, but then I'm a romantic. I believe that everyone is capable of more than what they've convinced themselves they are. I believe people are capable of genuine connection and authentic joy. I believe love is the most important thing in the world. Victoria laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. You're an architect who designs community centers and believes in love. How refreshingly naive. Perhaps, Adrian said, or perhaps I've seen enough of the alternative to know that it doesn't work. People can build empires on top of each other, but they're still fundamentally alone. I think being fundamentally alone is the tragedy. Before Victoria could respond, her father's voice cut through the cool night air. Victoria, there you are. I need you back inside. The senator wants to discuss the agricultural development project. James Sterling appeared on the terrace, his expression shifting to something more guarded when he saw Adrian. Victoria watched her father assess the young man and come to some conclusion that didn't particularly please him. This is Adrian Blackwood, a friend I just made, Victoria said, something perverse making her want to complicate the evening. Adrian, this is my father, James Sterling. Pleasure, Adrian said, extending his hand. James shook it, his grip firm and deliberate, not warm but not hostile either. It was the grip of a man taking someone's measure. Blackwood, James said, his tone making the name sound like a question. Are you involved in the financial sector? Architecture, Adrian said pleasantly. James's expression suggested he'd asked and lost interest in the answer. Well, I'm afraid I'll have to borrow my daughter. There are people we need to speak with. Of course, Adrian said easily. He turned to Victoria, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was genuinely lovely to meet you, Victoria. I hope our paths cross again. Perhaps, Victoria said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her. As her father led her back inside, Victoria could feel Adrian watching her go. She told herself she would never see him again, that this had been a pleasant but meaningless interaction, but she found herself returning to it throughout the rest of the evening, unable to quite dismiss the way he'd looked at her, as though he was seeing something more than the ruthless CEO, something more than the persona she'd spent years constructing. It was terrifying.
I have an office on the 23rd floor, he said, gesturing toward the elevator. I'm designing a green initiative for the building. We keep meeting because we work in the same building. It's funny how fate works. Fate isn't involved, Victoria said, but she made no move to step away from him. It's just probability and coincidence. Same thing, depends on your philosophy, Adrian said. He was looking at her with that warm intensity that unnerved her so completely. Have you eaten? No. Would you like to? There's an excellent Thai place a block from here, and I promise not to ask any intrusive questions about your motivations. And if I'd prefer to go home, Victoria asked, though they both knew she wouldn't. Then I'd respect that decision, though I'd be deeply disappointed, Adrian said. I find I look forward to our meetings, and I suspect, based on the fact that you haven't immediately told me to leave you alone, that you might feel something similar. Victoria wanted to deny it. She wanted to maintain her carefully constructed boundaries. But the truth was, she had thought about him often in the past 3 weeks, had even looked up his work, which was indeed impressive, had found herself wondering if the city could possibly be small enough that they might encounter each other again. "One dinner," she said, "but I need to be clear about something. I'm not looking for a relationship. I don't have the emotional bandwidth or entanglement." "I'm aware," Adrian said, smiling. "You told me you don't believe in love. It was one of the saddest things I've ever heard anyone say with such conviction. But I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm asking for dinner." They went to the Thai restaurant, and then they went to drinks, and then they walked through the city streets as the night deepened around them. Adrian told her about his childhood in rural England, his decision to become an architect, the moment he realized he wanted to design spaces where people could connect rather than compete. Victoria, surprisingly, found herself talking, really talking, about her mother's departure, about the void it had left, about the way her father had filled that void with the proposition that success was love, that dominance was affection. She didn't tell him everything, she maintained her walls, but she let him see more than she'd ever shown anyone. "In fact," Adrian said as they walked through Washington Square Park, "that somewhere inside you, you're still that 8-year-old girl looking for her mother, and you've convinced yourself that since she chose to leave, the best thing to do is make sure no one can ever leave you again by being indispensable to them through fear and respect rather than love." Victoria stopped walking. "That's quite an analysis. Is it wrong?" She considered lying. It would have been easier, but there was something about Adrian that made lying feel pointless, as though he would see through it anyway, and the attempt would somehow cheapen what was developing between them. "No," she said quietly, "it's not wrong." "The problem with that strategy," Adrian continued, "is that it doesn't actually make you indispensable. People respect fear, but they don't love it. And without love, there's nothing permanent. There's only dominance, and dominance is exhausting." "Is this the intrusive questioning you promised not to do?" Victoria asked, but there was no real anger in her voice. "Yes," Adrian admitted. "I'm sorry, but I'm also not sorry, if you understand the distinction. You matter to me already, which is strange because I barely know you, but there you are." They continued walking, and eventually Adrian walked Victoria back to her car. At the door, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so gentle and intimate that Victoria had to fight against the urge to pull away. "I'd like to see you again," Adrian said. "Not because I think I can fix you or because I expect anything to change, just because I like you." "I'll think about it," Victoria said. But she was already thinking about when she could see him again. Over the next 2 months, Victoria and Adrian developed a pattern. They would meet for dinner twice a week, sometimes more. Adrian became a kind of counterweight to the ruthlessness of her professional life. He challenged her assumptions, asked her difficult questions, and somehow made her want to be someone more than the ambitious corporate shark she'd become. But she was careful to maintain boundaries. She didn't introduce him to her father. She didn't take him to industry events. She kept him compartmentalized in her life, a separate thing from the empire she was building, as though the two couldn't exist in the same space. Her father, however, was becoming increasingly aware that something had shifted in his daughter. "You're distracted," James said one afternoon in her office. He'd come in to discuss the final acquisition they'd been planning, a company called Meridian Industries, which would give Sterling Industries near monopoly control over the luxury market in 3 key regions. "I'm not distracted," Victoria said automatically. "You are," James insisted, settling into the chair across from her desk. He'd done this since she was a child, physically positioned himself across from her, like they were adversaries in a negotiation. In many ways, they were. "You're sleeping less, Your focus during meetings is fragmented, and you've turned down 3 networking opportunities in the past month. This is unlike you." Victoria considered how much to tell him. Her relationship with Adrian was something separate and private, and she sensed instinctively that her father would see it as a liability, a weakness to be exploited or eliminated. "I've been seeing someone," she said carefully. "It's nothing serious." James's expression sharpened immediately. It was predatory in its intensity. "Who? Does it matter?" "Yes," James said flatly, "because I need to know if it's going to compromise the company. We're about to execute the most aggressive acquisition strategy in Sterling Industries history. I need you at full capacity. I need you focused." "My personal life doesn't affect my professional performance," Victoria said, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Adrian did affect her. He was eroding the careful separation she maintained between different parts of herself, was making her question decisions and assumptions she'd previously taken for granted. Everyone's personal life affects their professional performance. That's when strong leaders minimize personal complications. They either eliminate them or they compartmentalize them so completely that they become irrelevant. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the city. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost affectionate. "When your mother left, it devastated me. But you know what I realized? Attachments are liabilities. They make you weak. They make you vulnerable to manipulation. I've spent your entire life trying to teach you to be strong, to be autonomous, to need nothing and no one. Don't unlearn those lessons now." Victoria wanted to argue, to defend what she had with Adrian as something separate from weakness, but she was too well trained in her father's logic to do so convincingly. "I haven't unlearned anything, and I haven't lost focus." "See that you don't," James said. He returned to her desk and placed a thick folder in front of her. "The final acquisition, Meridian Industries. The CEO is a man named Marcus Ashford. He's been running the company for 15 years, built it into what it is. He has significant emotional investment in the company, and he's currently in talks with 2 competitors. If we're going to win, we need to move quickly and decisively." Victoria opened the folder and began scanning the documents. As she read, her analytical mind took over, identifying weaknesses in Meridian's position, opportunities for leverage, potential vulnerabilities. "What leverage do we have?" asked Victoria. "His eldest son," James said, and Victoria's head snapped up. James Ashford, no relation to the family, 28 years old, graduated from Yale, worked his way up through the company. According to our research, he's recently been having financial difficulties. His marriage is falling apart, and he's been spending significantly more than he earns, $60 million in debt to be precise. We could buy out the debt, gain leverage over him, force him to pressure his father to accept our offer." "Exactly," James said. "Acquire the son's debt, and you acquire the father's capitulation. It's clean, it's legal, and it's effective." Victoria should have felt the usual satisfaction at this kind of elegant manipulation. This was what she was good at, seeing how to pull the levers that made people move the way you wanted them to move. But something made her hesitate. "Isn't that excessive?" she asked. "We have the financial power to make a legitimate offer that would benefit Meridian shareholders." James gave her a look of disappointment. "Who are you? You've never shied away from necessary leverage before." "I know," Victoria said quietly. "I just thought—" "You thought what?" James's voice was sharp. "This is what business is. It's power, it's dominance, it's understanding that everyone has a price and finding what that price is. If you've forgotten that, you're useless to me." The words hung in the air like a physical force. Victoria felt something inside her recoil, but she responded the only way she knew, by shutting down her emotions and engaging her intellect. "I'm right," Victoria said. "I'll handle it." But after her father left, Victoria sat for a long time, the folder open in front of her, staring at the name James Ashford and wondering who she would have to become to destroy him. Victoria met Adrian that night at a restaurant he chose, a small Italian place in the West Village that served incredible pasta and wine that was unpretentious but exceptional. Adrian was already seated when she arrived, and he looked up with that smile that still managed to unsettle her, even after 2 months of seeing him. "You look like you've had a difficult day," Adrian observed as she sat down. Victoria considered maintaining her usual facade, but she was tired of the separation between the different versions of herself. "My father wants me to destroy someone, a man named James Ashford. His company wants to acquire his company, and we've identified a weakness, his son, and a way to exploit it." Adrian set down his wine glass carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" "How I feel is irrelevant," Victoria said. "It's business." "That's not what I asked," Adrian said. "I asked how you feel about it." Victoria looked around the restaurant, at the other couples and groups of friends dining together, living what presumably were normal lives with normal ethical frameworks. She felt profoundly separated from them, as though she existed in a different reality where her father's logic was the only logic that made sense. "I feel like I'm going to do it anyway," she said finally, "because I'm good at doing it, and because it serves the company, and because my father expects it. And that's the real answer, Adrian. I feel conflicted, but not enough to refuse." Adrian reached across the table and took her hand. "Then let me ask you another question. Who are you becoming? Because the woman who told me 2 months ago that love was irrelevant, I think she was lying to herself. But the woman in front of me right now, she's actually believing the lie, and I'm watching it happen, and I don't know how to stop it." "Maybe you shouldn't try," Victoria said, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Maybe," Adrian agreed, "but I care about you too much to accept that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you to have dinner with James Ashford's son, not to seduce him or manipulate him, just to look him in the eye and see him as a human being, then decide if destroying him is really what you want to do." "That's insane," Victoria said. "That's deliberately sabotaging my position." "It's one dinner. If afterward you decide that you want to go ahead with your father's plan, then I won't mention it again. But I think if you meet him, if you look him in the eye, you'll find that he's not some abstract problem to be solved. He's a person with pain and struggles and hopes. And I think once you see that, the whole thing becomes more complicated." Victoria should have refused, should have ended the evening right there and never seen Adrian again. He was asking too much, was interfering in her business in ways that could only damage both his position and her own if her father found out. "How would I even arrange such a meeting?" Victoria asked. "That's the beautiful thing about the modern world. You could follow him on social media. You could accidentally encounter him at a bar or gallery opening. You could find a way." Victoria knew he was right, and despite her better judgment, despite everything her father had taught her about avoiding unnecessary complications, she found herself nodding. "One dinner, and then I decide what to do based on what I learn. That's all I ask," Adrian said. Finding James Ashford proved easier than Victoria expected. She discovered through his social media that he frequented an art gallery in Chelsea, and she arranged to be there on a Thursday evening when he was scheduled to attend a private showing. She was careful to make it look accidental, approaching the gallery from an unexpected angle, recognizing him near the bar with a look of pleasant surprise. James Ashford was younger than she'd expected, with dark blonde hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested too many late nights and too much stress. He was drinking a bourbon neat and looking at a painting with the expression of someone trying to find something meaningful in it. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying just the right note of hesitant friendliness. "I think we met at the Hensworth Foundation Gala 6 months ago. I'm Victoria Sterling." James looked up, and Victoria saw recognition flicker across his face. She'd been featured in enough magazines that most people in his circle would recognize her name, if not her face. "James Ashford," he said, extending his hand. "Yes, I remember. You're the corporate raider." There was no judgment in his tone, just statement of fact. Victoria smiled. "Business strategist. Raider sounds so violent." Isn't it violent? James asked, and there was something like genuine curiosity in his voice. I've read about your acquisitions. People lose their positions, their influence, their sense of security. That seems violent to me. Victoria found herself genuinely unsettled. She'd expected either deference or hostility, but James was neither defensive nor impressed. He was simply honest. "Do you work in a similar field?" she asked. "I work in my father's company, Meridian Industries. I'm not great at it, to be honest. I'm more interested in art and design and philosophy than business strategy. But family expectations are powerful things." He said it without self-pity, just as a statement of fact. Victoria realized she was looking at a younger version of herself, at what might have happened if she'd had the courage to resist her father's vision for her. "That must be difficult," she said. "It is," James agreed, "and it's made worse by the fact that I'm apparently not as good at separating personal and professional ethics as I should be. I've made some poor financial decisions, thinking they were temporary, and now they've become permanent problems. My father doesn't know the extent of it yet, but he will soon, and when he does, I suspect his disappointment will be significant." Victoria felt something twist inside her chest. This man was confessing his vulnerabilities to a stranger, unaware that the stranger was there to hunt him, to identify the exact weaknesses he was admitting to and use them as weapons. "Perhaps things aren't as dire as you fear," she said carefully. "Perhaps," James agreed, "but I'm a realist. I know the world doesn't work the way I'd like it to work. I know that people like your father and you run the world, and people like me either find a way to adapt or we get crushed." He said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. He'd already accepted his role in the hierarchy. He was already resigned to his own destruction. Victoria excused herself shortly after, claiming she had another engagement. But as she drove home, Adrian's words echoed in her mind. He's not some abstract problem to be solved. He's a person with pain and struggles and hopes. She called Adrian and asked him to meet her at her apartment. Adrian arrived with wine and found Victoria sitting in near darkness, staring out at the city lights. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, had let her hair down. She looked younger, more vulnerable, less like the ruthless CEO and more like the woman he'd glimpsed that night on the terrace. "I met him," Victoria said, not bothering with greetings. And he's a good person," Victoria said flatly. "He's struggling with his father's expectations. He's made some poor financial decisions that he's ashamed of. He's aware that he's not suited for the corporate world, but he's trying anyway because his father wants him to. He's me, Adrian. He's the version of me that never learned to kill the softer parts of myself." Adrian poured 2 glasses of wine and sat beside her. "What does that change?" "Everything," Victoria said. "Nothing. I don't know." She turned to face him. "My father wants me to acquire his debt, use it as leverage to force his father to sell the company to us. It would destroy James Ashford. It would destroy his marriage, his position in the company, probably his relationship with his father when the truth comes out. And I was going to do it without hesitation because that's what my father taught me to do. But now I can't stop thinking about the way he talked about his failures," Victoria said, "like he'd already accepted them, like he'd already made peace with the idea that he's not who his father wanted him to be. And I realize that I've never made peace with anything. I've just gotten very good at not feeling it." Adrian took her hand. "What do you want to do?" Victoria was quiet for a long time. "I want to refuse. I want to tell my father that I won't do it. But I also know that if I do, everything I've built will crumble. He'll think I'm weak. He'll see it as proof that Adrian has compromised me, that I'm no longer the successor he needs. And honestly, I'm not sure that I'm brave enough to lose his approval." "Then don't lose it. Tell him you couldn't identify sufficient leverage. Tell him the deal isn't viable. Find a way to refuse that doesn't require you to explain your ethical reservations." "That's lying," Victoria said. Yes, Adrian agreed, but it's a different kind of lie than the ones you've been telling yourself. Victoria looked at him with something like desperation. I don't know how to be anyone except who I am, and who I am is someone who does what needs to be done, regardless of the cost. That's not true, Adrian said. You're someone who does what she's been taught to do, but you're not bound by those teachings. You can choose something different. Can I? Victoria asked, or am I just as trapped as James Ashford is, just in a different direction? Adrian didn't have an answer to that, which might have been the most honest thing he could have offered her. Victoria made a decision that night that would reshape the course of her life. She went to her father the next morning and told him that the Meridian Industries acquisition had become too risky. The market was showing signs of saturation in that sector, she explained, and the company's value would likely decline within the next 2 years. It was better, she said, to focus on other opportunities that offered more solid long-term growth potential. James Sterling studied her for a long moment, and Victoria could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was assessing whether she was telling him the truth or whether something had compromised her judgment. "Fine," he said finally, "but I'm disappointed. I thought you saw what I saw in that acquisition, the power of it, the elegance of the strategy." "I did, but I also see the risk." After she left his office, Victoria should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt haunted by the knowledge that she'd made her first real choice that went against her father's direction. It was a small thing, a refusal that she disguised as business strategy, but it felt monumental, as though she'd stepped across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. For the next 3 months, Victoria continued to see Adrian while maintaining her professional responsibilities. She began to change, subtly at first and then more noticeably. She started making decisions based on things other than pure profit, supporting companies with strong ethical practices, declining acquisitions that would harm communities, using her power to help rather than dominate. Her father noticed. "You're becoming soft," he said one afternoon, not bothering to hide his disdain. "These investments you've been making, they're financially sound, but they don't maximize shareholder return. You're thinking like a social worker, not a CEO." "I'm thinking like someone who can afford to care about things beyond quarterly reports," Victoria said. "We're already wealthy. We don't need to be wealthier. Maybe we can be better." James's expression was cold fury. "That architect, I knew that man was poison. I knew he was weakening you, making you into something less than you were meant to be." "He's making me into something better," Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was terrified, as she always was when facing her father's displeasure. "He's making you into someone disposable," James spat. "Love is a trap, Victoria. It's the vulnerability that destroys empires. And now you've allowed it to consume you. You're no longer the successor I raised. You're just another victim of sentiment." Victoria felt something crystallize inside her. For her entire life, she had been afraid of her father's disappointment. She had structured her entire personality around avoiding it, around being exactly what he wanted her to be. But in that moment, she realized something. His approval would never be enough to fill the void her mother had left. No achievement, no conquest, no amount of dominance would ever make her feel loved. Because James Sterling didn't love her. He wanted her to be a reflection of himself, a mirror of his power. That wasn't love. That was narcissism. "Then I'm disposable," Victoria said, "because I'm not giving up Adrian, and I'm not going back to being the person I was." James stared at her with an expression of such profound contempt that for a moment Victoria wavered. This man had shaped her entire identity, had been the central force in her life since her mother's departure. Walking away from him meant walking away from everything she'd built herself around. But then she thought of Adrian. She thought of the way he looked at her, as though he could see all the broken parts and wanted to help them heal. She thought of the possibility of being known rather than feared, of being loved rather than respected. "Get out," James said coldly. "You're fired." This is my company as much as yours. You can't fire me. I can and I will, James said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. I'll call a board meeting this week. I'll explain that you've become too emotionally compromised to lead. I'll produce documentation of your recent decisions, which will show a pattern of decreased financial acuity. And by next month, you'll be removed from your position, stripped of your executive authority, and left with nothing but your salary and your dignity. And given your current trajectory, I'll make sure that salary is as minimal as possible. Victoria's breath caught. She realized that her father had already anticipated this possibility, had already planned for the scenario in which she might betray the vision he had for her. This was who James Sterling was, someone who maintained contingencies against everyone, who trusted no one completely, who was always prepared to destroy anyone who failed to meet his expectations. "You would really do that to your own daughter?" Victoria asked, though she knew the answer. "I would do it to ensure that Sterling Industries survives. You're replaceable, Victoria. Everyone is replaceable. The only thing that matters is the institution, and if you can't see that, then you're weak, and weak links must be removed." Victoria left his office without another word. She went directly to Adrian's apartment, and she wept for the first time in over a decade. She wept for the little girl who had tried so desperately to fill her mother's absence with achievement. She wept for the years she'd spent building walls and cutting off parts of herself. She wept for the relationship with her father that had always been transactional rather than genuine. And Adrian held her through it all, not saying anything, just being present, just loving her in the simple fact of his existence. James Sterling moved quickly. By the following week, he had called an emergency board meeting and presented his case for Victoria's removal with the kind of meticulous precision that made his argument almost unassailable. He brought financial analysts who could point to her recent decisions as examples of decreasing acuity. He brought character witnesses who suggested she'd become unstable. He even brought Adrian into it, suggesting that her relationship with him constituted a conflict of interest and a personal vulnerability that was compromising her professional judgment. The board, many of whom owed their positions to James's patronage, voted unanimously to suspend Victoria's executive authority pending a full investigation. Her access to company resources was immediately frozen. Her contracts were examined for breaches, her emails and communications were subpoenaed. Victoria's initial response was shock. She'd always assumed, on some level, that her father's threats were exaggerations, that when confronted with the reality of losing his daughter, he would back down. She hadn't truly believed he would go through with it. She'd been catastrophically naive. Adrian wanted to fight. He suggested hiring lawyers, filing suit for wrongful termination, taking her father to court. But Victoria knew something that Adrian didn't. James Sterling had spent decades building relationships with the city's most powerful lawyers, judges, and politicians. Any legal battle would be long, expensive, and ultimately futile. Her father had too many advantages. What Victoria didn't anticipate was that James would go further than simply removing her from the company. The first attack came in the financial sector, through a series of complex maneuvers that she didn't fully understand until her own lawyers explained them to her. James Sterling moved to seize her personal assets. He claimed that during her time as CEO, she had made unauthorized transfers of company funds to personal accounts. It was a lie. Victoria had never done any such thing, but the investigation was muddy enough that her assets were frozen pending resolution. The second attack came in the press. A series of carefully leaked documents suggested that Victoria had been using her position to funnel business to companies owned by Adrian's family. His father had a small construction firm. This was also false, but it was damaging in ways that mere falsehood couldn't entirely capture. It planted seeds. It created the narrative of corruption. Within a month, Victoria had lost access to her assets, her company, and most of her professional reputation. She and Adrian moved into a smaller apartment in Brooklyn, and she took a job as a consultant for a mid-sized firm that was willing to overlook the scandal, mostly because they paid her well below market value and got a famous name for their letterhead. Adrian was devastated by how quickly everything had fallen apart. "This is my fault," he said one evening as they sat in their sparse apartment. "If I hadn't pushed you to refuse the Meridian acquisition, if I hadn't asked you to meet James Ashford, if I hadn't been so insistent about your father being wrong, then I would still be who I was before. And yes, I would still be powerful and respected and secure, but I would also still be empty, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering what my life could have been if I'd had the courage to be someone different. But the cost is worth it," Victoria said, and she meant it. "I have no money, no position, no family, but I have you, and I have myself. For the first time in my life, I actually like the person I am." Adrian pulled her close, but Victoria could feel the doubt in him. He was a man of principle and goodness, but he was also a man who understood the weight of consequences. He hadn't anticipated how thoroughly James Sterling would destroy his daughter. 3 months into Victoria's exile from Sterling Industries, a woman came to her consulting office with a folder full of documents. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she was the daughter of one of James Sterling's longest-serving board members. "Your father is planning something," Margaret said, laying photographs on Victoria's desk. They were pictures of Adrian, photographs taken over the past several weeks, showing him meeting with various people at various locations. "I don't have the full picture, but I know enough to warn you. Your father has become obsessed with destroying Adrian Blackwood. He's hired investigators, offered money to people in Adrian's circle, and he's building toward something." Victoria's blood ran cold. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because my father is one of the people James is using," Margaret said. "Because I listened to him on a phone call with your father, and I heard things that made me sick. Because I think what's happening is wrong, and I'm betting that you're the kind of person who would want to know." After Margaret left, Victoria sat alone in her office, understanding dawning. This was her father's final move. He couldn't destroy her completely. She'd already lost everything he could take. But Adrian still had things he valued: his career, his reputation, his ability to do the work he loved. And James Sterling would take all of it. Victoria went to Adrian's office and found him reviewing plans for a new community center in the Bronx. He looked up with a smile that broke her heart. "We need to talk," she said. She told him everything. She explained what Margaret had said, what her father was planning, what the endgame was. Adrian listened in silence, his face growing darker. "We should leave," Adrian said finally. "Move somewhere my father can't reach us. Start over." "He'll reach us," Victoria said. "That's not how James Sterling works. He doesn't let grudges expire. He lets them compound. If we run, he'll pursue. If we hide, he'll find us. The only way to stop him is to meet him directly." "How?" Adrian asked, and Victoria heard the desperation in his voice. Victoria thought about it, and slowly an idea formed. It was ruthless, and it required her to become something close to the person she used to be, but it was the only way. "I need to go back," Victoria said. "I need to get close to him. I need to understand what he's building against you." "Absolutely not. That's insane. That's using yourself as bait." "That's the only way to stop him," Victoria said, "and I need you to not ask me to explain, because I can't do this if I have to justify it every step of the way." "Victoria, I love you, and I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war happening in his expression between his desire to protect her and his recognition that she might be right, that this might be the only path available to them. "Yes," he said finally, I can do that. Victoria's first step was to reach out to her father. She did it carefully through an intermediary, a lawyer she'd worked with before, someone who had no strong loyalty to either party, but who understood that message delivery was sometimes a profitable venture. The message was simple. She wanted to meet with him. She wanted to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. James agreed to meet with her at his office, which told her that his arrogance had not diminished. He was so confident in his control over her and her eventual capitulation that he was willing to see her face to face. Victoria dressed carefully for the meeting, in clothes that were expensive but not showy, in a style that suggested someone struggling but trying to maintain dignity. She pulled her hair back, minimized her makeup, chose everything to project a narrative of defeat. When she entered his office, James was standing at the window, looking out over the city. He turned slowly, and his expression was exactly what she'd expected, contempt mixed with a certain satisfaction, as though her fall had been inevitable and he was pleased to see his predictions validated. "You look diminished," he said, not bothering with greetings. "I am," Victoria said, and she let her voice carry the appropriate amount of shame and defeat. "I've made mistakes. I've lost everything. I've had time to think, to reflect on the lessons you tried to teach me, and I realized that I threw away something valuable in pursuit of sentiment and weakness." James gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Victoria sat, maintaining the posture of someone defeated, someone asking for mercy. "I want to come back," she said. "I want to earn back your trust. I want to remember who I was supposed to be." "That's impossible," James said coldly. "You've been compromised. You've shown your weakness to the world. No one would respect you in a position of authority." "Then give me time," Victoria said. "Let me prove myself, not in a public-facing role, but behind the scenes. Let me be your advisor, your strategist. Let me show you that I've learned." James studied her, and Victoria could see him considering. What she was offering was almost perfect, a chance to reclaim her daughter, to prove that his methodology was correct, to have someone loyal working within the company. But he was too clever to accept it without conditions. "If I allow this," he said slowly, "there would be requirements. You would work directly for me. You would report only to me. You would have no access to any position of authority, but you would have access to everything I'm working on. And you would cut off all contact with Adrian Blackwood. Complete severance. No communication whatsoever." Victoria felt her chest tighten at the last condition, but she had anticipated it. "I understand." "Do you?" Adrian asked, and there was something almost kind in his expression. Not actual kindness, but the appearance of it, the mask he wore for people he wanted to manipulate. "Because if you're lying to me, if you're working with that architect against me, I will destroy you so thoroughly that the collapse of Sterling Industries from the inside would seem like a mercy." "I understand," Victoria repeated, "and I agree to your conditions." James nodded, and Victoria felt the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. She had just committed to complete separation from Adrian for an indefinite period. She had just pledged herself to her father's service again. She had taken on the role of the victim, the penitent, the grateful daughter who had learned her lesson. It was a lie, but it was a lie her father would believe because it was the only outcome he could imagine. Victoria moved back into her childhood home and began working in her father's personal office. Her days were spent reviewing documents, analyzing market opportunities, and yes, understanding what James was building against Adrian. And what she learned was worse than she'd anticipated. James was not simply trying to destroy Adrian's reputation. He was constructing a legal trap. He was working with federal authorities to build a case that Adrian had been utilizing illegal shell companies to launder money for various criminal enterprises. The evidence was entirely fabricated, but it was fabricated by people who knew how to make fabrication stick. Accountants, lawyers, forensic specialists, all of whom owed their livelihoods to James Sterling's patronage. The genius of the plan was that it would eventually lead to Victoria herself, framing her as the intermediary, the one who had convinced Adrian to utilize the shell companies. By the time the authorities were finished, it would be clear that Adrian was guilty and Victoria would be guilty of conspiracy and money laundering, but there would be evidence suggesting that she had been manipulated by him, that she had been under his emotional control. It was calculated to destroy everyone in its path. And it was actually brilliant in a dark and twisted way. Victoria realized that her initial plan to get close to her father and somehow stop him had been naive. She couldn't stop him through direct confrontation. He was too powerful, too well-connected, too skilled at these games. But she might be able to stop him through redirection. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria very carefully began to create evidence. She used her access to her father's files to gather documentation of his illegal actions. She found communications between him and federal authorities that constituted quid pro quo arrangements. He would provide information about criminal enterprises in exchange for protection from investigation. She found evidence of bribery, tax evasion, and in one case, something that looked dangerously close to evidence of a crime much darker than corporate malfeasance. Then she took everything to the one person she thought could use it, Margaret Chen's father. Samuel Chen was a pragmatist, a man who'd built his power through careful alliances and an understanding that loyalty was conditional on utility. Victoria approached him carefully, explaining that she had come into possession of evidence that James Sterling had been manipulating federal investigations, and that this evidence would be worthless to her but potentially valuable to someone in a position to leverage it. "Why would you give this to me?" Samuel asked suspiciously. "Because I want my father out of power. Not destroyed, I'm not that ruthless anymore, but removed from a position where he can hurt people. And because my daughter told me that what he's building against Adrian is wrong, and I trust her judgment." Samuel took the evidence, and Victoria waited to see what he would do with it. What happened next was not quite what she expected, but it was effective. 2 weeks later, James Sterling was arrested. The charges related to financial fraud and obstruction of justice, not to the more serious crimes Victoria had found evidence of. The federal authorities, working with some mysterious pressure from unknown sources, were offering him a deal: resign from Sterling Industries, forfeit a significant portion of his wealth, and cooperate with an ongoing investigation into certain federal officials, and the charges would be reduced to white-collar crimes with relatively light sentences. It was exactly the kind of elegant destruction that James Sterling might have orchestrated against an enemy. Victoria suspected that Samuel Chen had orchestrated it against her father. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. By afternoon, the Sterling Industries Board had moved to remove James Sterling from his position as chairman. By evening, he had announced his resignation. By the next morning, he was gone, moved into a hotel suite while awaiting trial, separated from his company and his power, still wealthy but no longer dominant. Victoria received a phone call from her father while she was sitting in her apartment. She moved out of his house the day the news broke, reclaiming the small apartment in Brooklyn where she'd lived with Adrian. "You did this," James said. His voice was deadly calm, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd been screaming. "I did what was necessary," Victoria said. "You've destroyed the legacy I spent my entire life building. You've betrayed me in ways that I didn't even think were possible. And you know what the worst part is? I taught you everything you needed to do this. I taught you how to deceive, how to manipulate, how to strike when your enemy was vulnerable. You turned my own lessons against me." "I did," Victoria acknowledged, "and I think that was the point of teaching them to me, wasn't it? You wanted me to be able to do what needed to be done. Well, I did what needed to be done." James was quiet for a moment. "Did you do it for him? For Adrian?" Victoria considered lying, but there was no point anymore. "Partly, but mostly I did it for myself. Mostly I did it because I couldn't live in a world where my father was building weapons against the man I love. Mostly I did it because despite everything you taught me, I still believe that some things matter more than power." "Then you're weak," James said, and he hung up. Victoria sat with the phone in her hand for a long time, but she felt no grief, no sense of loss. That chapter of her life was finished. Adrian was waiting for her at the apartment when she arrived, having somehow known that she would come straight there. She didn't question how he knew. Some things didn't require explanation. She told him what she'd done, everything from her infiltration of her father's office to her deal with Samuel Chen. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression moving through shock and concern and finally settling into something like understanding. "You put yourself in danger," he said when she finished. "Yes," Victoria acknowledged, "but it was the only way to keep you safe, and now it's done." "Now what?" Adrian asked. Victoria considered the question. She had no job, no company, no clear path forward. Her name was still attached to the scandal surrounding her father, though it was becoming clear that she had been working against him, not with him. The world was open and uncertain in a way it had never been before. "I don't know," she said. "For the first time in my life, I actually don't know what comes next, and it's terrifying, but it's also wonderful." Adrian pulled her close, and they stood together in their small apartment, just holding each other. Outside, the city continued its endless operation, indifferent to the personal dramas of two people who meant nothing to its vast machinery. But inside, for the first time since her mother had left when Victoria was 8 years old, she felt something like peace. Over the following months, Victoria's life slowly reorganized itself around different principles than it had operated on before. She took a position as a strategic consultant for a firm that specialized in sustainable development, work that paid less than half of what she'd been making as CEO of Sterling Industries, but that filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced in the corporate world. She and Adrian moved into a larger apartment in a neighborhood that was neither trendy nor prestigious, but that had good light and a community feel. Adrian continued his architectural work, and his reputation, though initially tarnished by association with Victoria, recovered quickly. His designs were in demand, and he was recognized for what he'd always been, a skilled architect with vision and integrity. But there were complications that Victoria hadn't anticipated. The media was fascinated by her story, the prodigal daughter, the CEO who'd rejected power for love, the woman who'd brought down her own father. Different outlets constructed different narratives, some framing her as a hero, others as a victim, still others as someone complicit in scandal. More troubling was the impact on her finances. Although her personal assets had eventually been unfrozen, much of her wealth remained tied up in Sterling Industries, which was now in freefall due to the scandal. She would eventually receive a significant settlement when she and her father reached a divorce of sorts, separating her personal finances from the company. But for now, she was living on a fraction of what she'd once had access to. Adrian never made her feel that this was a burden, but Victoria felt it. There was a part of her that still measured success in terms of wealth and power, and she was struggling to unlearn that measurement. 6 months after her father's arrest, Victoria received a phone call from Samuel Chen. He invited her to dinner, and she accepted, curious about what he wanted. He was a man in his late 60s with the easy confidence of someone who'd been powerful for a very long time, but there was also something in his expression that suggested calculation, an understanding that this dinner was not social but transactional. "Your father and I have reached an understanding," Samuel said after they'd ordered. "The federal authorities have agreed to reduce the severity of his charges in exchange for his cooperation in several ongoing investigations. He'll likely serve 2 to 3 years, which is light for what he did, but heavier than he would have if we hadn't intervened." "Thank you for telling me this," Victoria said, though she wasn't sure what Samuel wanted in return for this information. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand something. Your father taught you how to play these games, how to move the pieces on the board, and you played them very well against him. But you should understand that in doing so, you became indebted to me. I didn't help you destroy your father out of altruism or because my daughter asked me to. I did it because he represented a threat to my interests, and eliminating him served my purposes." Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd always understood this on an intellectual level, but hearing it stated so plainly was different. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to work for me," Samuel said. "Not publicly. I want you to be my strategic advisor, the way your father was an advisor to several federal officials. I want your intelligence, your understanding of markets and power structures, your ability to see 3 moves ahead. In exchange, I'll make you wealthy again, more wealthy than you were before, and I'll ensure that your father's influence in the world is permanently minimized." Victoria set down her fork carefully. "And if I refuse? Then I do nothing further. You keep what you've earned through your consulting position, you live a quiet life with your architect, and your father eventually serves his time and potentially rebuilds something of his influence. Or you could refuse and I could ensure that happens faster, though I won't because I still value my relationship with my daughter." It was a trap, Victoria realized. She had exchanged her father's domination for the potential of someone else's. By accepting Samuel Chen's help, she had incurred a debt that could only be repaid through servitude. "I need to think about it," Victoria said. "Of course," Samuel agreed, "but don't think too long. The offer expires in 1 week." Victoria told Adrian about Samuel Chen's offer that night, and Adrian's response was immediate and unambiguous. "Don't do it," he said. "You spent years trying to escape your father's control. You don't get to do that only to replace him with someone else." "But he could protect us," Victoria said. "He could ensure that my father never has the power to hurt us again. He could make sure that people like him don't have the opportunity to build what he's built." "At what cost?" Adrian asked. "Victoria, you'd be trading one cage for another. You'd be spending your life advancing Samuel Chen's agenda instead of your own." "Maybe I don't have an agenda," Victoria said. "Maybe I just want to exist without worrying about power and control." "Then do that," Adrian said. "Choose obscurity. Choose work that matters to you. Choose me. Choose a life that isn't about strategic positioning, but don't choose Samuel Chen thinking that it's a different path. It's not. It's the same path you were already on." Victoria knew Adrian was right, but there was a part of her, the part that her father had cultivated and shaped over 3 decades, that recognized the appeal of what Samuel Chen was offering. There was comfort in having someone powerful in her corner, someone who could protect her, someone who could ensure that she never again experienced the kind of vulnerability she'd experienced when her father had turned against her. The day before the deadline, Victoria made a decision. She met with Samuel Chen again, and she told him no. She told him that she appreciated his offer, but that she wasn't interested in becoming anyone's tool, not even in exchange for security and wealth. Samuel took the refusal with grace, even with a kind of respect. "I thought you might refuse," he said. "Your father was never willing to refuse me, which is why he was always vulnerable to me. But you have something he doesn't have. You have someone you love more than you love power. That's your greatest strength and your greatest weakness." After Victoria left his office, she felt lighter than she had in months. She had been offered a form of power, and she had chosen love instead. It was a choice her father would have deemed insane. It was a choice her younger self would have thought impossible. But it was her choice. 6 weeks after Victoria's rejection of Samuel Chen's offer, Adrian came to her with a proposition. "I've been offered a major project," he said, "a museum in Berlin designed from the ground up to be a space where people from different communities can connect and understand each other's perspectives. It's a 3-year commitment, and it would require me to move." Victoria's heart sank. "Are you asking me to come with you?" "I'm asking if you want to," Adrian said. "I'm also asking if you're ready to leave New York, to leave the city where you've built your entire life, to take a risk on something completely new." Victoria thought about this for a long time. 3 years ago, she would have said no immediately. The idea of leaving the city, the company, her power base would have been unthinkable. But so much had changed. She had changed. "Yes," she said, "I'll come with you." They moved to Berlin 2 months later. Victoria took a position with a local sustainability consulting firm, and Adrian threw himself into the museum design. For the first time in her life, Victoria lived somewhere she had no power base, no advantages, no established reputation. She was just another American living abroad, learning a new language, trying to understand a new culture. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. But there were costs to this new life that Victoria didn't fully understand until they became apparent. Approximately 6 months into their time in Berlin, Adrian received a phone call informing him that his parents had been in a car accident. His father had survived, but his mother had not. Adrian left immediately for England, and Victoria went with him. Standing at the funeral, Victoria realized how little she actually knew about Adrian's family. His father, William, was a kind-looking man in his 80s, and Adrian had 2 brothers and a sister, all of whom had families of their own. Victoria had met them once, briefly, but in the midst of grief she felt like an outsider, someone who belonged to Adrian's life but not to his history. After the funeral, as they were driving back to Adrian's childhood home, Adrian took her hand. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about my mother, about what she told me just before we left for Berlin." Victoria waited, sensing that whatever was coming was significant. "She told me that she was worried," Adrian continued, "about the way I had immersed myself in you. She said it reminded her of how my father had done the same with her, how he'd made her the center of his universe and eventually lost his sense of himself in the process. She told me to be careful not to make you my entire world." "What did you tell her?" Victoria asked. "I told her that it was different, that I was with you by choice, that I loved you for who you are, not for what I wanted you to be. But I've been thinking about it, and I realized she might have been right. I've been so focused on you, on us, on creating this perfect life together, that I've neglected other parts of myself. I haven't kept in touch with my brothers. I've been absent from my parents' lives. I've made you the center of my existence in a way that isn't healthy." Victoria felt something break inside her. "Are you saying you want to leave me?" "No," Adrian said firmly. "I'm saying I want to rebalance. I want to create a life where I love you, but I also maintain connections to my family, my friends, my own interests and identity. I think what happened with your father and Samuel Chen taught us something. When we give someone else complete power over our emotional world, we become vulnerable. And I don't want to be vulnerable to you in that way. I want to love you, but I also want to be free." Victoria understood what he was saying, and she understood that he was right. She'd spent so much of her life in relationships where love meant giving someone else dominion over her, whether it was her father or Samuel Chen or now Adrian. She had never allowed herself to simply love someone while remaining fundamentally autonomous. "I want that too," she said, "but I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if I'm not completely invested in you, I'll lose you." "You might," Adrian said, But you might also find that love is stronger when both people are whole, and you might discover that you can be loved not despite your independence, but because of it. Over the next year, Victoria and Adrian both made conscious efforts to build lives that included each other but were not entirely dependent on each other. Adrian reconnected with his family, spending a month every summer in England and maintaining regular communication with his brothers. Victoria made her own friends in Berlin, took on solo projects that didn't involve Adrian, developed interests and pursuits that were entirely her own. It was harder than she expected. There was a part of her that wanted to fall back into the pattern of making Adrian her entire world, of defining her identity through their relationship. But she resisted that impulse, and over time, something remarkable happened. She became more herself, which paradoxically made her a better partner to Adrian. Adrian's museum project was extraordinary. He designed a space that was literally built around connection. Different architectural elements encouraged people with different perspectives to meet, to understand each other, to recognize their common humanity. The museum opened to international acclaim, and Adrian was offered position after position, projects after projects, but he chose carefully, taking only work that resonated with him, that aligned with his values. It was watching Adrian do this, carefully selecting which projects to pursue rather than pursuing every opportunity, that made Victoria understand what she wanted to do. She left her consulting position in Berlin and started her own firm focused on helping small companies and nonprofits develop ethical business practices. She worked with organizations that wanted to make money but were also interested in doing good. It was less lucrative than corporate consulting, but it was more meaningful. She found herself genuinely excited to go to work, genuinely invested in her client's success. She was, for the first time in her life, building something that wasn't designed to dominate or destroy. She was building something designed to help and heal. 4 years after Adrian and Victoria left New York, Victoria received a letter from her father. James Sterling had been released from prison after serving 2.5 years on a reduced sentence. He had aged considerably. The photographs included in the letter showed a man who had been diminished by incarceration, though not broken. He had written to her not to ask for forgiveness, but to explain some things he thought she should know. He wrote about his childhood, about how his own father had been a brutal man who valued only success and power. He wrote about how he had learned to equate love with dominance, how he had believed that the way to protect people he cared about was to make them strong enough to survive in a cruel world. He wrote about his marriage to Victoria's mother, about how he had loved her in the only way he knew how, by trying to possess her, by trying to reshape her into something that fit his vision of what she should be. He wrote about how Victoria's mother had left not because she didn't love him, but because she loved herself more, and that this realization had come too late to save their relationship. And he wrote about Victoria. He wrote that he had come to understand, in prison, that he had done to her exactly what had been done to him, that he had perpetuated the cycle. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was not asking for her to reestablish contact. He was simply writing to tell her that he understood, finally, what he had cost her, and that whatever peace she had found, he hoped she held on to it. Victoria read the letter multiple times, and each time she wept. She wept for the little girl who had lost her mother and tried to fill that void with achievement. She wept for the woman she had become, sharp and brilliant and deeply, fundamentally lonely. She wept for the man her father was, shaped by his own father's cruelty, perpetuating a cycle of emotional violence he didn't fully understand until it was too late. She showed the letter to Adrian, and he held her while she cried. When she was done, she asked him if she should write back. "Do you want to?" Adrian asked. "I don't know," Victoria said. "I feel like I should, but I'm also not sure if reaching out would be for his benefit or mine." Then wait, Adrian said. Give yourself time to process. If you feel moved to write back in 6 months, in a year, then you will. And if you don't, that's okay too. Victoria didn't write back in 6 months, but in a year she sat down with pen and paper and wrote her father a letter. She didn't offer forgiveness because she wasn't sure what that word meant in the context of their relationship, but she wrote that she understood now that he had done the best he could with the tools he'd been given. She wrote that she wished things could have been different. She wrote that she was building a good life and that she was grateful for whatever in his teaching had made her strong enough to survive what came after. She wrote that she hoped he had found some kind of peace. She never heard back. 8 years after leaving New York, Victoria and Adrian returned to the city for a project consultation. Adrian had been offered a position overseeing the development of a major sustainable housing initiative in Brooklyn, and he wanted to discuss it with Victoria before committing. They spent a week in the city, and Victoria was struck by how much had changed and how much had remained exactly the same. The buildings she'd passed every day for 32 years were still there, but they looked different to her now, less like markers of power and more like architectural spaces where people lived and worked and struggled and loved. On their last evening, Adrian suggested they have dinner in Manhattan. Victoria agreed reluctantly, sensing that returning to the epicenter of her former power might be difficult. The restaurant Adrian chose was upscale but not pretentious, the kind of place where beautiful people gathered but not exclusively. Victoria was dressed in a simple but elegant dress, her hair down for once, her makeup minimal. She was 40 now, and she carried her age well. There was a kind of grace to her, a wisdom in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She was looking at the menu when a voice from her past cut through the restaurant noise. Victoria Sterling. She looked up and found James Ashford standing beside their table. He was older than she remembered, his face lined with stress and experience, but his eyes were kind. He wasn't alone. He had a woman with him, dark-haired and warm-looking, with the comfortable ease of someone secure in her position. Victoria's heart caught in her chest. James Ashford, the man she had almost destroyed on her father's behalf, the man whose vulnerabilities she had identified and exploited, the man whose humanity Adrian had forced her to acknowledge. "James," she said, her voice steady, "it's been a long time." "It has," James agreed. He glanced at his companion, who nodded and returned to their table, giving them privacy. "I've thought about reaching out to you many times. After your father was arrested, after everything came out about what he was planning, I realized that you had actually saved my life. If you hadn't refused to destroy me, I would have been destroyed, and I would have deserved it because I was planning to do the same thing to others that your father did to me." Victoria gestured for him to sit, and James pulled up a chair. Adrian watched this interaction with interest, understanding without being told who this was. "I want you to know," James continued, "that I used the second chance you gave me. I got out of my father's company, I went back to school, I became an art consultant, which is what I always wanted to do. I'm happy now. I'm genuinely, authentically happy, and I owe that to you." Victoria felt tears prickling at her eyes, which she blinked back. "I'm glad. I'm genuinely glad." "I also want you to know," James said, "that your father reached out to me about 3 years ago. He was recently released from prison, and I think he was trying to make amends, or at least to understand what his actions had cost people. He told me that you had always been better than he was, that you had the capacity for mercy he never developed. He asked me to tell you if I ever saw you again, that he was proud of the person you'd become." After James left, returning to his companion with a warm smile and a gentle hand on his back, Victoria sat in silence. Adrian reached across the table and took her hand. "You okay?" he asked. "I was planning to destroy him," Victoria said quietly. "I identified his weakness. I was going to exploit it. I was going to ruin his life. And instead, I showed him mercy, and it changed everything for him." "It changed everything for you, too," Adrian said. Victoria nodded. It did. It made me wonder what else might be possible if we chose differently. 3 months after returning to Berlin, Victoria received another letter, this one from a lawyer. Her father had died of a heart attack. His estate was substantial, not as substantial as it had once been, given his legal battles and time in prison, but significant nonetheless. The majority of his estate he had left to charitable organizations focused on environmental protection and community development. But to Victoria, he left something unexpected, his personal journals documenting his life from age 18 onward, and a letter. Victoria read the journals first. They were brutal in their honesty, documenting her father's internal struggles, his manipulation of her mother, his slow hardening into someone capable of emotional cruelty. But they also documented moments of doubt, moments where he wondered if he was doing the right thing, moments where he questioned the entire framework that he had built his life around. The letter was brief. "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not writing to ask for it, but I want you to know that you succeeded where I failed. You had the opportunity to become like me, and you chose not to. You had the power to continue the cycle that was perpetuated on me, and you broke it. That took a kind of strength that I never possessed. I spent my life building an empire because I believed that would make me safe, that would prove I was worthy of love, but I died alone, with only my wealth to show for it. Don't make the same mistake I did. Hold on to what you have with Adrian. Hold on to the goodness you found. That's worth more than all the power in the world. The journals are yours now. They're a record of a life that became something ugly. Perhaps they can serve as a warning to others, or perhaps they can simply help you understand that I was human, flawed, and doing the best I could with the damage that was done to me. I'm sorry. Love, Dad." Victoria wept when she read that final word, Dad instead of James, a return to the intimate language of childhood, and she understood in that moment that her father had loved her the only way he knew how. It wasn't the way she needed to be loved, and it had caused her tremendous harm, but it had been love nonetheless. She decided to publish the journals, edited for privacy but otherwise unvarnished. She wrote an introduction explaining who her father had been, what he had taught her, and what she had learned in breaking away from him. The book became unexpectedly popular, a meditation on ambition and power and the ways that love can be distorted by fear. The proceeds went to the same charitable organizations her father had supported, continuing his legacy in a way that he never could have. A year after her father's death, Adrian proposed. He did it simply, without pretense, in their apartment in Berlin on a Sunday morning. "I want to marry you, not because I need to own you or possess you or make you permanently mine, but because I want to build a life with you, consciously and deliberately, every day choosing you and asking you to choose me." Victoria said yes, but not immediately. She asked Adrian if they could wait a year before getting married, saying she wanted to be completely certain that she was making the choice for the right reasons, not out of fear or neediness, but out of genuine desire to build something with him. Adrian agreed, and they spent that year preparing. Victoria finished her business in Berlin, and she and Adrian moved to London, where Adrian took a position with a firm specializing in sustainable architecture, and Victoria launched her firm's UK division. A year later, they were married in a small ceremony with close friends and family. James Sterling's grave was not visited. There was no family pilgrimage. Instead, they spent their honeymoon in Portugal, walking along the coast, reading books, simply being together in the easiest way possible. When Victoria was 45 years old, she was contacted by Sterling Industries. The current CEO had been diagnosed with a terminal illness and was looking to step down. The board wanted to know if Victoria would consider returning to lead the company she had once been fired from. Victoria's first instinct was to refuse. Sterling Industries represented everything she had escaped from, everything she had spent years learning to define herself against. But then she considered what she might do with that power if she chose to use it differently. She negotiated a complex arrangement. She would take a 5-year position as CEO, during which she would restructure the company to be more ethically driven while maintaining profitability. After 5 years, she would hand the position to someone younger, someone with the vision to take the company in whatever direction she had started it moving. Adrian was uncertain about this choice. He said, "I thought we'd left that world behind." Victoria agreed. "We had, but I realize I have skills and power that could be used for something good, and I think I've grown enough that I can use that power without it using me. I want to try." Adrian considered this, and then he nodded. "Okay," he said, "but we do this together. I'm not disappearing into the background while you become consumed by work again. I don't want you to. I want you beside me. I want us to build this as equal partners." And that's what they did.
Victoria's tenure as CEO of Sterling Industries was marked by dramatic changes. She restructured the company's supply chain to ensure fair labor practices. She invested heavily in environmental sustainability. She began a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in business and ethics. She made decisions that reduced short-term profits in the name of long-term sustainability and corporate responsibility. Many in the financial world criticized her approach, saying she was destroying shareholder value, that she was being sentimental, that she wasn't ruthless enough. But the company survived. More than survived, it thrived, because it turned out that there was a market for corporate goodness, that consumers would pay premium prices for products from companies they felt good about supporting, that employees were more productive and loyal when they believed in what their companies were doing. Victoria hired the best people she could find, people who shared her vision of what business could be. She created a workplace culture that valued both excellence and humanity. She made herself accessible to employees at every level, not through democratic pretense, but through genuine interest in understanding how her decisions affected people's lives. 5 years into her tenure, she stepped down and handed the company over to a woman named Sarah Chen, the daughter of another executive and someone who had worked her way up through Sterling Industries from an entry-level position. Sarah had the same vision Victoria did, to prove that corporations could be profitable and ethical simultaneously. Victoria returned to her consulting practice and her work with Adrian on various architectural projects. She was 50 now, and she had discovered a kind of peace that she'd never thought possible. Not the peace of victory or dominance, but the peace of alignment, where her actions matched her values, and her life reflected her choices rather than her circumstances. 15 years after leaving Sterling Industries for the final time, Victoria and Adrian stood on the observation deck of a building Adrian had designed. It was a community center in Brooklyn, built on the site where Sterling Industries had once maintained one of its manufacturing facilities. The building was beautiful, all glass and light, designed to be a gathering space for people from every walk of life. Adrian's hand was in hers, and they were watching children play in the garden he had designed, their laughter rising up like prayer. "I was thinking," Adrian said, "about the night we met at the gala. Do you remember what I told you?" "That I seemed tragic," Victoria said, "that people were capable of more than what they'd convinced themselves they were capable of." "I also said that love was the most important thing in the world," Adrian reminded her, "and I've spent 15 years watching you figure out how to love yourself, me, your work, the world. It's been extraordinary to witness." "I wouldn't have gotten here without you," Victoria said. "You wouldn't let me hide. You wouldn't let me settle for power instead of peace. You saw who I could become, and you refused to let me be anything less." Adrian pulled her close. "But I also learned from you," he said. "I learned that strength isn't the opposite of kindness. I learned that it's possible to be both powerful and good, both ambitious and ethical. I learned what it means to stand beside someone rather than behind them or in front of them." They stood together in silence for a long time, watching the world they had helped build. Their lives were not perfect. There were still challenges, still difficulties, still moments of doubt and fear. But they had built something real, something that could withstand pressure because it wasn't built on dominance, but on mutual choice. Victoria thought about her mother, who had left when she was 8 and whom she'd spent 30 years trying to replace in her father's eyes. She'd never found her mother, had never discovered what had happened to her or where she'd gone. But in building her life with Adrian, in learning to love in a healthy way, in breaking the cycle of emotional manipulation that had nearly consumed her, Victoria had perhaps found what her mother had been searching for all along: freedom. Victoria sat in her office, not at Sterling Industries anymore, but at her consulting firm, which had grown into something significant and respected, and looked at the photograph on her desk. It showed her and Adrian on their wedding day, both of them smiling with genuine joy. She was 60 now, and Adrian was 63. They had no children. That was a choice they'd made together, deciding that they wanted to pour their energy into their work and their relationship rather than into child-rearing. Some people thought this was tragic. Victoria thought it was beautiful. She received occasional updates about her father's legacy. Sterling Industries was thriving under Sarah Chen's leadership, having become one of the few corporations consistently ranked as among the most ethical in the world. The scholarships her father had funded had helped hundreds of students attend university. The charities he had supported were making real differences in communities across the world. She received occasional updates about Samuel Chen as well. He had retired from his power brokering position and become a philanthropist, using his influence to support social justice causes. Margaret Chen, who had warned Victoria about her father's plans, had become a successful attorney specializing in white-collar crime, helping prosecutors take down corporate corruption. And she received occasional letters from James Ashford, who still thought of her every year on the day she had chosen not to destroy him. He had built a life that he loved, with a wife he adored and children he was close to. He had become an advocate for corporate ethics and had publicly told his story about the moment a competitor had chosen mercy over destruction, and how that choice had changed the trajectory of his entire life. These letters always made Victoria cry, not from sadness, but from the knowledge that her choice to become someone different, to break the cycle of cruelty and dominance, had rippled out into the world in ways she could never have anticipated. On her 60th birthday, Victoria's firm threw her a party. Colleagues and friends and mentees came to celebrate her, to talk about the work she'd done, the changes she'd made, the lives she'd impacted. Adrian gave a speech in which he talked about the night he'd met her, about the woman she'd been, brilliant and broken and desperate to prove her worth through domination. He talked about watching her transform, not into someone different, but into the fullest version of herself. And then he asked everyone to raise their glasses to Victoria, not for her achievements, he said, but for her choices. For every moment she chose love over power, connection over dominance, truth over pretense. For every moment she chose to be human rather than a monument to her own success. After the party, Victoria and Adrian walked through the city, past the buildings and monuments and historical sites. Adrian pointed out architectural elements and told her about the decisions that had been made in designing them, the compromises and the victories. Victoria found herself moved by the beauty of it all, the human effort to create spaces where life could happen, where people could gather and connect and become more than they were alone. "I want to ask you something," Adrian said as they walked, "and I want you to answer honestly." "Okay," Victoria said. "Are you happy?" he asked.
Victoria considered the question. It was not a question her younger self would have known how to answer. Happiness had seemed like a luxury, something frivolous in comparison to success and power and domination. But she had learned over 20 years what happiness actually was. "Yes," she said, "I'm genuinely happy. Not perfectly happy. I still struggle with my instinct to dominate, to control, to win at all costs. But I recognize those instincts now, and I choose something different. And in that choice, I find peace. That's all I ever wanted for you, to find peace." "I know," Victoria said, "and I spent years thinking that was weakness, but now I understand that choosing peace in a world that rewards violence, choosing love in a world that rewards power, choosing connection in a world that rewards dominance, that's the ultimate strength." They walked hand in hand through the city as the sun set, casting long shadows across the streets. Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the child desperate to fill her mother's absence, through the ruthless CEO willing to destroy anyone to maintain her position, to the woman she had become, who understood that the greatest power lay not in taking, but in giving, not in winning, but in creating, not in being feared, but in being loved. It cost her everything, and it gave her everything that actually mattered. And that, she thought as Adrian squeezed her hand, was the real ending to the story. Not triumph, not revenge, not even conventional happiness, but the quiet, profound contentment of a life lived according to one's own values, of relationships built on mutual choice rather than dominance, of work that contributed to the world rather than extracted from it. It was, in the end, a happy ending, not because all the pain had been erased or all the damage repaired, but because Victoria had learned that happiness wasn't the absence of struggle. It was the ability to struggle towards something meaningful with someone you loved beside you, choosing every day to be the person you wanted to be rather than the person you were made to be. And in that daily choice, that constant, deliberate alignment between her values and her actions, Victoria found something that all her years of power and dominance had never given her. She found herself.